Welcome, everyone. It's another episode of the Transform Your Birth podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. I very much appreciate your attention. Today, we're looking at the prevention of birth trauma. Now, Australian and international research suggests that up to 1 in 3 women identify their birth experience as traumatic. Psychological birth trauma is estimated to affect between 10 to 44% of women. I'll put the references to this research down in the show notes. Now, that figure is hideous, and it's something that has been brought to the attention of different governments and medical systems. And just recently, the New South Wales government released the Birth Trauma Inquiry. Now, all the recommendations in that inquiry were directed towards our medical system and what they can do to improve conditions and support for birthing women. But what I want to talk about today in this podcast is what we can bring to the party and how we can make a difference to that figure. Now, preparation is paramount. By preparing, we can learn how to support ourselves so that if we do need help, we have the understanding and the capacity to get what it is that we need when we need it. Now, trauma, in a very simple definition, is too much, too soon, for too long without support. So when our nervous system gets overloaded and our mind doesn't know what to do to protect ourselves either mentally, emotionally, or physically, then it can put our whole system in a state of flux. And trauma tends to sit in the short-term memory and get replayed over and over again. It's why we can have things like flashbacks. Now, sometimes women are able to process those experiences through a little bit of extra support, but sometimes birth stories can stay with us for many, many years. I once met a woman on a train, and she asked me what I did for a living, and I told her that I was a childbirth educator, and she started to tell me the story of her birth, and it brought her to tears. Now, this woman was in her 80s. That birth story was 60 years old, and that's when I realised how powerful and significant birth is in the life of a woman. It's what drives a lot of what I do today. So in this episode, I want to explore the elements of preparation that can help us to experience our birth in ways that set us up for parenting and potentially avoid trauma. Now, obviously, we all want to avoid trauma, and it's not big on our bucket list, is it, girls? And sometimes that leads people to make decisions that feel like we can maintain some form of control, because we know birth is a mystery. We can't control it. And so we look for ways to control, and that's really understandable. In fact, your whole mind wants to know that it can control things. And so that can lead women to making decisions like an elective cesarean or an epidural. Now, these decisions are often created out of fear. And that can be really appropriate. Every woman has the right to make these decisions for herself. I never believe that it's up to anybody to project their ideas onto that woman. She has to follow her own path. But if that is something that you're considering, I would caution you to just step back a little bit, and before making these decisions, just to get a little bit better educated and understand the process and what Mother Nature's trying to bring into this to benefit you as you prepare to become a parent, because this is a really big job. And so we can very easily oversimplify birth and make these decisions without realising the cost and the full consequences of what these decisions mean. I'll tell you a story of a woman I worked with. She rang me up and told me that she was choosing to have a cesarean under a general. She had a huge fear around childbirth. So I encouraged her to come and see me, and we did some work together. What I discovered about this woman is she'd spent a lot of time in hospitals when she was a little girl, and she had a massive fear of hospitals and doctors. Now, by opening herself up and exploring a lot of what was driving that decision, which was fear, what happened is she opened herself up to new possibilities. Now, it was fascinating to watch this woman go through her process of change with a little bit of extra support from me to process some of those fears. Also, with new information and understanding about the birth process and the power of it and how it then sets you up for parenting, she made the decision to walk her own path. Now, what ended up happening is I ended up being her doula, and her baby was in the breech position. And so her doctors were talking to her about having the baby by cesarean. And this was a woman who couldn't even talk to doctors without shaking uncontrollably. Her fear was so intense. And I remember she asked me to come along to this meeting to talk about what her options would be. And I laughed because I just sat there. She didn't need me at all. She was standing there with her hands on her hip saying to this doctor, well, tell me about these options. Why can't I birth this baby vaginally? And she really challenged what she was being advised to do. And what was beautiful is she ended up having an amazing birth. It was via cesarean, but it was on her terms and in a way that really supported her empowerment as she was about to now walk into the role of being a parent for the first time. So I watched that journey unfold. And even though she did end up with a cesarean, she did it in a way that was very, very different had she have just decided to do it under a general. So the other thing too, I'd also caution you when it comes to making these decisions is also it's very important that you prepare for other potential scenarios, because things can come out of left field, like going into labour and that labour progressing really quickly at home. So if you've got your mind fixated on one way of doing birth and one way only, you could be setting yourself up for a really big fall. I'll tell you another story. I had a gorgeous woman. She was a GP and she came and did my course, and she said to me at the end, she said, I've really loved learning this stuff. It was fantastic, but I just want you to know I'm having an epidural. I said, well, you go, girl. You have whatever you want. I don't judge. I just laughed at her. I said, well, you go and have your epidural and enjoy the process. Anyway, I saw her in my mother's groups, and she came up to me and she said, I don't know if you remember me, but I was the woman who went through your course and still decided she was having an epidural. And she said, you'll never guess what happened. I said, what happened? And she said, well, I went into labour at home and I was having such a lovely time at home that my labour progressed really quickly. And when I got into the hospital, I ended up having a bloody natural birth. She said, the last thing I wanted was a natural birth. I wanted my epidural. And I said, well, how was it? She said, oh, look, it was amazing. But then she said to me, she said to me at the end, but if I'm having another baby, I'm going to get that damn epidural. And I laughed. I said, you got what you deserved. I said, you were so fixated on that epidural. It looks like life was going to teach you differently. So we had a bit of a laugh about it. But it's a great example of don't just put all your eggs in one basket, okay? Now, my goal for my families is to prepare them for birth under all circumstances. So let's really look at what are the decisions you can make and the preparation that you can do that can help you to avoid going down that path of trauma. Now, one of the most important decisions you'll be making is your choice of carer. Now, in the birth trauma inquiry, what came out very, very strongly was continuity matters. Relationships matter when it comes to choosing your carers. Now, there's a bit of a continuum when it comes to carers. At one end, you've got the midwifery model of care, which are trained to see birth as a normal, everyday event. It's a state of health, and they tend to be more woman-centred. So there's more choice, there's more conferring to the woman for what she wants. Up the other end of the continuum, you have obstetricians, gynecologists, and so they're specialist doctors in this field, and they're trained to be that wonderful safety net. So if we need help, they're the people you want around and in your camp. And we're very, very fortunate to have them because they know a lot of things about protecting mothers and babies that midwives and we don't know. And so together, those two models work beautifully. When it comes to making decisions, sometimes people go for continuity of a known obstetrician. So that's generally under private health. And that's giving you the continuity of knowing that if things get complex, you know who your doctor's going to be. But it is important to realise that you're not going to know the midwives who will be with you for most of that labour. You'll be dealing with people coming in and out of in and off duty during your birth. Then we have in the public system a fairly fractured model where you'll get different midwives for your antenatal care, different midwives for your birth, and then different midwives postnatally. And so that can be very discombobulating, if you like, because when you don't know those people, you often get conflicting advice. Some you'll gel with, some you won't. So then there are also models of care that involve continuity of a known midwife. And so these are the birth centre models, and also in home birth, so independent models where the midwife works outside of the system. She might have visiting rights to the hospital if it needs a transfer, but she follows you all the way through. So those models of care tend to be the most popular. They're often the hardest to get into. So if you don't have continuity through your actual labour, because you've got midwives coming on and off duty, another way of creating continuity is with what's called a doula. Doulas are wonderful people. They come in and it's what I used to be. They come in and they fill that continuity gap that can be there. The other option could also be to get a student midwife. Student midwives are doulas without the price tag, so that's another option. So you can explore that. But when it comes to having good care, it's so very important that your relationship is built on equality. Your voice matters. There's no place for ego or arrogance in the labour room, okay? So that's the old midwife who carries on like, she knows better and has this idea, or sometimes even doctors as well. When your care doesn't include the thoughts and feelings of the mother and that individual pregnancy, so looking at what's going on with my pregnancy and not just this is our policy, then that's a big red light, okay? My midwife who worked with me with my first son, she had a classic quote. She said, women know what they need. They don't know that they know, but if you ask them, they know. She was a midwife of 30 years experience, and she knew and understood and worked very closely with the intelligence of the mother and her body, what she senses about that pregnancy. So that's very important. But I do believe that people tend to know where they need to birth. When they look at the different options, you'll get a sense of where you feel the safest. I worked with a beautiful woman having her 5th baby, and her first 3 had been very straightforward births in the birth centre. Her 4th ended up being a breech, and she had that baby via cesarean. And when she was pregnant with her 5th, and I was her doula, I assumed she'd just go back to the birth centre. And she said, no, I'm looking at a different model this time. I think I want to get my own doctor. And I thought, well, why would you want your own doctor? You don't, her labours had been straightforward and there was no complexity with this particular pregnancy. But I didn't say anything. I let her go off, and she met with this particular private obstetrician, and it was love at first sight. And what was so interesting was 2 weeks after making that decision to go with a private obstetrician for baby number 5, she discovered that that baby was going to require surgery within 24 hours of being born. So she knew that she needed a different model. She didn't know why she knew. She just followed that inclination, and it taught me a very valuable lesson. So don't be afraid to change caregivers if you feel like you're not in the right place, or get a second opinion. I often share my story with my first son. I was 38 weeks pregnant when I realised I had the wrong doctor. When I got a second opinion, I had a second doctor say the exact opposite to what my first doctor said, and that led me to the path of getting my own midwife with the backup of this second doctor. So that was an incredible decision that I made, and it was done very intuitively. I just no longer felt I was in the right place, And even though it was so late in my pregnancy, I still made that decision. And you know what? That's the reason I'm sitting here now talking to you. That changed my life in ways I could never have imagined. So listen to yourself, find where you feel safe. And if you can't get your first choice, perhaps also look at getting a doula or a student midwife for that continuity. The second thing is support. Now, women need to be supported by people who know what they're doing. When women feel safe, loved, and supported, they labour very differently. They're less likely to go into a state of stress, and they can go into the zone of labour, into that part of their brain where they're working with the birth, not against it. So partners need to know what they're doing. I once supported another woman who was having her fourth baby, and she came to me and she said she just didn't like childbirth. And would I be her doula? And that was great. I did her, I got her to do my course and I became her doula. Well, when I walked into her birthing room and she was in well-established labour, she was at the hospital when I first came in, her partner was in the corner and he didn't do my course because he was looking after the other children, but she did. And he was sitting there and reading the menu and filling out the menu for their options and cracking jokes. And he was actually a gorgeous man. So I went up to her and I started to massage her and she just melted. And I ended up massaging her for the whole birth, but I was aware that her partner was a bit on the outer. So I said, come and put your hands on her belly. And he was a big Greek man, so he had these big hot hands and he put them on her belly. And she said, oh, that feels fabulous. And then he went and got her a hot pack and he held the hot pack and I continued to massage her. Well, after the birth, she had a beautiful birth, very big baby. And after the birth, she said to me, you know, I've never been touched in labour. She said, I could not believe what a difference that made. So having someone who knows what they're doing, who can advocate and help you to find comfort is really, really important. Okay. So support is crucial. If you need to, once again, look for continuity, whether you could employ an independent midwife, a doula, or student midwives. The other thing about support is creating a birth map. And I recommend people go to Catherine Bell's website, birthmap.life. And what's good about this particular website is it helps you to map out your options. And when you understand the different choices you can make under certain conditions, then your partner or the people close to you can communicate those wishes. And we know that when women's voices are not heard during labour, that they're more likely to go down that path of trauma. So that person needs to know what your choices are able to communicate those, and to continue to make sure that your voice is being heard during that, because things can get busy for your caregivers. So you need a person who's assertive enough to say, no, we need this and we need it now. Okay? Women need to have that advocacy. So, and the other thing about support too is remember that support doesn't just stop at the birth. It takes a village to raise a child. So look at and maybe brainstorm, what are the people who you know who are in your world who can support you after the baby is born. That's really, really powerful. And then the final one is preparation. Now, preparation, knowledge is power. Knowledge, but knowledge that leads to understanding. There's a lot of information and we could get information overload. Your mind doesn't know what to do with information overload. It tends to put you into a state of feeling overwhelmed. So distilling that knowledge and understanding, which is what I do in my classes, where I keep it really, really simple so the mind can grab onto it and anchor and say, oh, that's how it works. It's that distillation, and not just knowledge, but also the how to deal with it. That's really important. So under what conditions, what would you do? Under these conditions, what would you do? And then, of course, the other part of the brain that we need to be aware of, and the mind, is the subconscious, because it's the subconscious mind that will dictate the birth process. So what gets in the way of the subconscious? our fears. So here's a question for you. What are you scared of around birth? I'd encourage you to write it all down, brainstorm, and to start to deal with your fears. I'll give you an example. I know a lot of people, particularly women, are afraid of tearing. There's a couple of things you need to know about tearing, which hopefully will help you to reframe this particular fear. At the time, you typically don't feel it happening, and there are much bigger things going on. It's like your care factor drops significantly during the actual process of birth. Here's another way of looking at it as well. You know, tearing tends to happen at the part of the body where the healing is at its greatest, where there's the most blood flow to those tissues. Isn't that interesting? There's even an intelligence to the tearing or the releasing of your baby. So it's important that you don't necessarily focus on it and just allow yourself to start to cultivate the belief that if it happens, I will be okay. If you cut your arm, you bring those tissues together and your body will heal it. Our vaginas are just the same. Our perineum is just the same. Okay? Yes, it might need a bit of suturing, it might need a bit of work, but it's really no different to that. It's interesting, I tore with my first birth, and my midwife never told me what degree tear I had, and I never asked. I was not interested. I didn't want to know how many stitches she put in there, and I suspect it was quite significant, but I never focused on it. What she did do is she drew a picture of it, and she showed me what she'd done. So I think that's a really important point. What you focus on, you fuel. If you just see it as something that's just part of the process, and I hear this a lot from women on the other side, they say, I thought it was going to be a bigger issue than what it was. Yesterday, I did a birth debrief with a woman who came to me because she was still struggling with trauma. Now, she hadn't done the preparation with me, and it was and it was obvious when I took her through that her preparation was very limited, and she had this belief that her body didn't work, okay, that her body let her down. And I had to, help her to understand how the body works in labour and how labour is actually wired in, and her body actually did respond to the birth. But she was struggling with the fact that she had an episiotomy, and she was really she was just struggling to accept that that had happened in her sacred cave. And I call our vaginas a sacred cave. And I did a little guided visualization with her to just go through her body. And then eventually we went down to that part of her body. And I got her to imagine that the sacred cave now has the etchings of the story of her journey into motherhood. And that this was Isabella's journey, and that was her story, and the marks of motherhood have now been etched into her sacred cave. As she completely changed the way she focused on her birth and the result, just by helping her to see it in a different light. Okay, so it can happen. It's not the end of the world, and we always can heal. Okay. Last week's episode, I had the lovely Hazel Keedle, who's a professor of midwifery at Western Sydney, and she shared with us the 4 elements that make a huge difference to the experience of the mother, which we've pretty much talked about a lot here already, but a couple of things I'll bring up from also what she talked about with birth experiences, that it's important for women to have control. And so one of the journeys that we're on when it comes to having a baby is we become aware that we're walking into the mystery. We don't know what's going to happen. And so that knowing can be very, for women, it can make them feel very fearful about birth. And there's a real intelligence to the fact that we are walking into the mystery, because guess what? Parenting is one as well. You can't control your child. You can't make them sleep. You can create the conditions for them to sleep, but you can't make them do anything. I mean, they are who they are. And so what we're learning around control in pregnancy, and then what we're learning through the birth, is setting us up for parenting. But there are things that we can anchor ourselves to that can make a big difference, like anchoring yourself to your breath, or anchoring yourself to an image or a word gives women a sense of control. So that's something worth preparing and starting to think about. What can you do with your mind while you're going through the intensity of birth? Another way we can feel in control is by having our voices heard through a birth map, a partner who can advocate, or a doula or a student midwife. And the final thing, she talks about having confidence, having support, which we've talked about, but also the final thing is being able to actively labour, which is have the freedom to move and respond to the comfort of her labour. Women who get stuck on beds feel trapped, and it's much easier to be overwhelmed by the birth process when we can't organically respond to the intensity of that labour. And women typically respond to labour in a way that supports the physiological process of the birth. You've got gravity while she's moving, and she'll do things that will support the descent of that baby. So being trapped on beds is a surefire way to cause women to emotionally and mentally feel overwhelmed. Okay? So if you do need to be monitored, make sure you ask for the monitor that gives you the freedom to move. So I hope that's been helpful. We've got a lot to contribute to the party of birth, and most of it can be done before the big day. Now, Transform Parenting hosts a couple of different birth courses and birth options to do the Transform Your Birth course. We have the weekend workshop here in Canberra that's done over a weekend. And we also have the ones online now, which are live online. We've got the Transform Your Birth live, and that involves working with me over 4 weeks for an hour and a half, and a combination of live as well as some video content. It's a little bit cheaper option, and in these times that can be really helpful to you. So there'll be information in the show notes about that, but please feel free to reach out to our organisation at any time. We prepare women not just for birth, but from birth all the way to the first 7 years of parenting. So it's wonderful. We stay connected to our families. We do weekly catch-ups just to check in on you, to make sure nothing from left field's happening, and give you the support of what you need when you need it. So I hope you've enjoyed today's podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. And we're going to take a little bit of a break on the podcast now for the next 4 weeks or so, but then we'll be back with some more wonderful stories for you. So tune in. Thanks for listening.